If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, follow, and rate on your preferred podcast platforms. If you would like to reach out to me, simply connect to me on Twitter. Links in the description.
So a lot of them kind of even reveal descriptions of or evidence of what the buildings looked like. So even if changes had been made to the buildings, you could tell from the paintings itself what the buildings were.
This is Sonali Dhanpal. She is an architect and a built heritage conservationist. She is pursuing a PhD in architectural history and theory. Her research work focuses on what it's like to live in a princely city in South India during the late 19th and early 20th century. She investigates urban expansion of Bangalore, residential extension, and how buildings are integral in understanding the culture and society. I'm terrible with most histories, but it surprises me that we can bring out many details and similarities. It also reminds me how fortunate we are to live in the 21st century. In this episode, we talk about architecture, history, and bubonic plague. Here's my conversation with Sonali Dhanpal. How did you get started with architecture? What fascinates you about about historical buildings and the story they tell? Can you tell us about your early encounters with architecture and why you continue to work on discovering our past through architecture?
Sure. So I did my undergraduate in architecture in Bangalore. And actually, the course, if anyone knows it or anyone knows architects, is very designed to build anew. So everything was about valorization, about building new structures. But then as I went along, I think quite quickly, or by it's a 5-year degree. So by my third year, I quite realized quite quickly that I wasn't really enjoying building or designing on just sort of expansive sites, and instead what I had a lot of fun with was when we had a lot of parameters. So okay, we had to only design within this restricted space, so we had to renovate a building and so on. And then in about my fifth year, we had an elective by someone who was a conservationist. So conservation just involves using historic structures or by restoring them or using them for different purposes. And so she did this elective for about 6 classes, and it made me realize why I didn't like just designing anew. And I think there was no looking back from there. So they then interned in this practice in Baroda called Karan Grover and Associates. And even though they were a very sustainable, inclined firm to sort of green buildings and LEED certified buildings and so on, he was also very interested in dabbling with historic precincts. So he had worked on some World Heritage Site projects and so on. And so the way he spoke about those, I enjoyed more than his other projects. And so after that, I decided to do a master's degree because without specialized training, it's quite difficult to work with historic buildings. And then I went on to work in Bangalore and in Bombay, and then now I'm doing my PhD in architectural history.
So how has your experience of exploring these historical buildings or sites evolved? As you learn more about them. Of course, you might see more detail than an average person, but how has that changed your perspective and changed your personality and how you see the world today?
I think that I'm convinced that there is absolutely no need for building anew, and that's not only from the perspective of saving something historic, but that architecture and the building industry is one of the largest contributors to climate change. And with the number of existing buildings and the building stock that we have, so much can be done. So conservation doesn't only mean like ornamental saving this 16th century temple, but it also means trying to readapt other structures for as exists. So I think in that way, saving something which is historic, and historic doesn't necessarily mean hundreds of years old, right? And to cater to today's use is something that has fundamentally changed, I think, the way I see the world, right? In relation to these structures. But then also there is while while I studied in the UK, and I went back to practice in Bangalore, I just think that it was so humbling because of the fact that just the range and types of buildings that were available to me to access for different types of work. So we would work on colonial era buildings, we would work on 16th century forts, and just the sort of gamut of buildings were just or structures or precincts is just so, I mean, it's just awe striking, and I think that has really changed the way I view what needs to be saved and what doesn't, and changed my perspective on the state that we're from, which is Karnataka, because so much of the work that I did was locally.
Uh, that's interesting because I wasn't aware of restoring a historical building and actually making use of it.
Mhm.
Usually, when I visit some old architectural sites, it's usually preserved and you know guarded off or just
Yeah,
for visiting purpose. So
yeah.
does this happen a lot? Do we actively restore old buildings and make use of them?
I think there is a very dated perception of restoration in India, and this is a fundamental problem of why that doesn't happen as much as it should in India, right? Whereas in different parts of the world, so like say even in the UK, about 55% of the buildings are old historic structures. So like even in the house that I'm staying and paying rent in at the moment is historic development that's kind of readapted to form new housing. So they use a lot of historic structures to cater to new uses, and of course, it does happen in India as well, but just far more smaller numbers. And I think it's very much linked to the fact that labor and construction is still relatively affordable, and as opposed to here. And I think that because of the construction of new development and new growth as something to be very sought after, there is a way of looking towards the new for solutions, as opposed to looking to the past for solutions, if that makes sense. So I think that it doesn't happen as much as it should, but I wouldn't say it doesn't happen at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think concrete is pretty expensive in terms of
Mhm.
our resources.
Sure.
Uh, so yeah, that's really nice that it is happening. Uh,
Mhm.
and you mentioned Bangalore. What are some of your favorite places or buildings to visit when you're in Bangalore?
Uh, so some of them are not necessarily buildings, but then okay, when let's begin with a building. So I think that there is a school in Chamrajpet called Fort High School. It was built in 1907, so that's about 123 years old to date, and I worked on the restoration from 2017 onwards. And so, I mean, it was one of those buildings that we worked in. So I was there day in and day out, and I have a very special connection to it because of that. But then I think that what I like about it the most is that, again, like answering your example of is an old building being used for some new use? It was built as a school and it continues to be used as a government school. So that's really interesting because we would see the students in and out every day, and you see the building being used, which is very lovely for someone who's a conservationist. And then the other thing is also that it adjoins a big ground which is open to public. So again, like it's not restrictive like many older bungalows, or quite high profile buildings are converted to private use, which then again acts as a barrier for other people to access it, right? So I think that's one of the really nice things about Fort High School. But then I think what I enjoy in Bangalore the most is, so um, I must be fourth or fifth generation from Bangalore. So I think for me, it's these localities that always have stories to them. So apart from the fact that Fort High School is Fort High School, my great grandfather used to live in Chamrajpet. So my mother remembers working with him and sitting in the Fort High School precinct grounds, for example. So for me, it's the buildings almost act as a background to all of this sort of these memories, right? And so there are all of these connections to it, both personal as well as historical, that make these precincts really fascinating. Other things just that I miss and that I really like in Bangalore were, I grew up in Baswangudi, so me and my brother used to go to Bugle Rock Park a lot. And so places like that have very intimate connections for me, and I think I enjoy them so much because of that.
And are most historical or
Mhm.
bungalows, like you mentioned, are mostly open to public? You mentioned some are owned privately. So if
Yeah.
somebody wants to visit, how would they do?
So that's it. This is the problem that pervades conservation itself, which is that basically the people who just as any so the organization that kind of deals with conservation in India or preservation in India is the Archaeological Survey of India. So this is a national authority that controls or is in charge of monuments from ranging from the Taj Mahal to the Red Fort, or even something in Karnataka like Hampi, right? Then there are state authorities that within the state will have monuments listed within them as well. But leaving these two aside, there are little uh, leaving these two aside, there's few mechanisms for other buildings to be protected. So their lists of buildings that they preserve are very limited, and their ideas, or these institutional ideas of what should be preserved, is also very limited. So what they say is that in terms of legislation, buildings that are not older than 100 years are not to be preserved, or I mean, rather than that, it says that they preserve buildings which are 100 years and older, right? So buildings like colonial bungalows and things like that really fall out of these definitions, not just because they're not, I mean, they may be 100 odd years old, but also it's their use that they're not monumental in their status, so they don't get saved. So most of them have also just kind of remained in families and so on. So it is quite difficult to both propose to save them, because also now they kind of tend to be in some of the most expensive areas in the city. So even for the government to acquire them, it's just a huge sum of money. And most of them either get demolished, or then they get converted to sort of private use like cafes and things like that. And while that's nice, it's also very limiting in who they allow inside it, because if you're going to have a cafe off commercial street, it's going to charge a certain amount to enter it and to use the space, right? So I think right now that most of the bungalows that are accessible would be limited by that. So, for example, Cinnamon, which is just very close to Commercial Street, it's a massive bungalow that has been converted to a cafe slash boutique. Then there are a couple in Frasertown, Bungalow 7, for example, which tends to get used for wedding venues and a kind of other events. So, so these are places that you can visit, but yeah, perhaps you may not be able to go in, or are limited in the ways that you can go in. But I would recommend maybe taking a walk through Cooktown or Frasertown, and then just looking from the outside, and just sort of passing through these areas near Coles Park and so on, and then kind of figuring out what these structures look like as you go.
What would you suggest to a non-academic or simply a traveler who wants to expand their experience, on their next visit to a historical structure? Are there some aspects of building architecture or its construction, or simply that something that you think gets usually unnoticed that might be interesting to pay more attention to?
I think that sometimes what I would recommend to people is to see buildings as results of processes of culture, society, and politics, whereas people view them as very artifact, like okay, it's built with this, it's this color, and so on. But really, they're a reflection of what society is. So they're very intimately connected by who they were owned by, where they're located, and so on. So often people get very bogged down with what style is this building, and what color is this building, and what is it made of, and those are really interesting, of course, because they give us very different observations and can tell us a lot about the past. But at the same time, to view or think about them, their making as a production of of society in that sense. So for example, Baswangudi was laid out in a particular way with, like a gridiron pattern, but then also from Krishnarao Park, you have these diagonal roads. And then kind of we have these drawings or historical drawings of particular communities and castes being put in different places, right? So when you go and see a building in Baswangudi, I think also what you should be asking is, oh, okay, this looks like this gate is made of this, and these buildings elements are made of that, but then why is it here, and what does it mean to have been here, and who owned it, and kind of who they were within political sort of who they were politically within. Were they were they a barrister? Did they work for the civil services? Were they someone of were they someone were they elites? And all of these kind of questions really shape the building itself, because the buildings are quite representative of status, right? So if we view buildings like that as a part of these processes, I think that people would see the value in saving them more than it's a nice thing to look at.
Yes, so basically learn more about the stories and
Yeah.
the kind of people who pushed technology back then to construct these buildings, and also craftsmanship,
Yeah.
which is quite interesting. Yeah, I don't do any of those.
So
uh,
let me give you an example. So sometimes if you are able to and you go and take a look at some of the tiles in, like, do you know what Mangalore tiles are? There are these clay tiles which are kind of made in a mold, and they're not
okay.
just curved. They have like for the lack of a better way to put it, serrated kind of edge. So usually if they're historic, or not if they are historic, usually they have like the company that made them and the date of their production or model number below them. And so you can tell the date of the building sometimes by just looking at that, for example. And then some of these factories were from the historic state of Travancore, which is now Kerala. Some of them are from Mangalore. So then, like, once you see things like that, then you start to put together this kind of network of materials going around, right? Like this notion or idea of modern materials being shipped and sent from across seems like a new thing, but it's not. So for example, that's just an example of how you piece together these structures as something a part of a bigger whole, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. In one of your talks, also you talk. What I got out of it is that
Mhm.
buildings can say so much about what was happening back then. So
Yeah.
even if there are no written documents left behind, uh, like you said, you can piece together a lot. So
Mhm.
that's really interesting. Uh, do you host workshops or events on architecture, or plan on doing so?
When I was working with Intac in Bangalore, we used to quite a bit, and I used to do some historic walks as well. And I'm hoping after the pandemic, when I do come back for some field work to Bangalore, I can do some. But at present, with the pandemic, everything I think has taken, I don't know, a backseat. But I think mainly I was working with students, so often I would conduct workshops to record buildings, so what we call surveying, so or measured surveying. So teaching students from colleges like BMS, or even have holding workshops. So mainly those interested in kind of surveying as how to measure a building, what do you record, how do you record it, and so on. So like some basics to talk about things like that. But then historic walks with Intac were kind of open to a wider public. So you used to get a range of age groups, and they were really interesting. And I think people had a great time while doing it. And I do miss it, but I think it'll be some time until we'll be able to do things like that again.
Speaking of students, does India have
Mhm.
enough people working in research and preserving historical buildings and sites? And also, are there enough funds being allocated towards this?
So there are both some things to how do you say, there are, I mean, I think there's a growing market for it. And what's interesting is that I was actually writing a paper about just how many women are represented within conservation, right? And so many firms have a large number of women working in conservation, which is really interesting. And I know little to say about why women are choosing to do this. So I mean, there's quite an interesting gender balance, but apart from which, over the last 10 years, I think there are about 8, 9 colleges now offering conservation as a viable master's degree for 2 years. So colleges like SPA, Bhopal, Delhi, CEPT in Ahmedabad, and so on, which are quite, I mean, very, very well known and renowned colleges that are offering this degree. And many are offering it even as a diploma course. And it's really expanding because they've started to look at textile conservation or material conservation as well. So like institutes like the National Institute of Design in Delhi, I mean, sorry, what is it called, sorry, I forget, NMA, sorry, National Museum. So they have run an institute that kind of focuses more on material conservation and object conservation. So I think there is a growing both in terms of funding as well as opportunity. But at the same time, I think that in India we're faced with like very, very different challenges from those of just having the number of people to do it. Because so these discussions of development versus heritage are huge problems, right? So like take for example, now in Delhi, where Lutyens' Delhi is trying, there's a Central Vista project that's trying to kind of change Lutyens' Delhi's design. And so really, heritage takes the back seat because it's overwritten by many other factors, the main being monetary ones. Because the construction industry is so driven by capital that heritage really does take the back seat in a country like India. So there are some quite sad realities of that. And of course then there are also, you're right in that funding, there is a huge lack of funding. So some sites are very well funded and have multiple people interested and multiple stakeholders who kind of continue its funding, and some just that are completely ignored. So some sites that I've had to visit in Karnataka, like there's a site called Lakundi which has something like 110 tanks and temples or something like that, like a huge number. And many of the tanks we used to go to find, and they would be in agricultural fields covered with greenery and really sort of obscured from view. So, and at the same time then you go to a site like Hampi, which is so well funded and has multiple stakeholders taking care of it. Of course it's not that doesn't mean that it's perfect and it doesn't have issues, but it's such a varied landscape that it's really difficult to say yes or no. But I think there are some things that are good, and that then an expansion of I don't know, the industry itself is good. And at the same time, there are some cons as well, and there's a lot to be done. Um, but also, I think that there has been huge governmental effort in terms of some sites, because how do you say, there are these projects which are these circuits, and I don't know whether you know of them, but like the government's quite recent proposal to make some historic circuits then mean that some sites get included within these massive smart city projects and so on, and then some don't. So yeah, I think that uh, yeah, there are very many contradictory things, but also some things that speak well of what the field is.
Uh, can, are the public involved in making such decisions, or whether or not to preserve or conserve a historical building? Or can the public even be involved in contributing to preserving or supporting?
Unfortunately, I think that's limited, right? Because most of the projects that get even the firms are getting hired by governments, national government, state government projects, and so on. Very few are privately preserved, and so really none of these decisions are very open to public kind of decisions, which then take in multiple stakeholders' opinions, right? And so these are very top down kind of projects. So unfortunately, no, and they're not really participants within a lot of large public processes like this. Of course there are some different ones. So for example, the fact that Ahmedabad's historic town, I mean historic city center, has been sort of listed as a UNESCO project has been a huge public effort, but then those are kind of the exceptions as opposed to the norm.
Can you talk about the wall paintings at Nagor Fort and your experience working with these paintings? What stories do they tell? Do the paintings talk about the science, medicine, agriculture, and conflict during that time?
Yeah, so basically I was there's a wall painting conservation course that is run by the Mehrangad Fort Trust. So Mehrangad is the fort in Jodhpur, which is a trust that is run by the Maharaja of Jodhpur, and they also control they are also the trust for Nagor Fort, right? And that's about a few hours away from Jodhpur. So they, in collaboration with an institute in London called the Courtauld, kind of ran this wall painting course every year for students or interested participants in India. So 6 week program where they introduced people who were interested to kind of engage with these wall painting, and then they selected mainly people who either were architects or working with conservation or sometimes even material conservators because it was fully funded by them and so on. So for 6 weeks, we kind of learned how to work or work with wall paintings, in the sense that for me, it was more the recognition of, if I found a building with wall paintings, to then defer it to a specialist as opposed to me tackling it myself, because I understand the complexity of what it means to preserve wall paintings rather than me doing it myself, if that makes sense. Um, but then I went to work with them as well the next year for another campaign. So I think it was just a very revelating experience, because these paintings were some of the best preserved paintings, examples of wall paintings in the country. And yeah, in terms of what they told us, what they taught us, so a lot of them kind of even reveal descriptions of or evidence of what the buildings looked like. So even if changes had been made to the buildings, you could tell from the paintings itself what the buildings were. So that was really interesting. And then just um, the institute that I was working with, the Kotol, had was is so specialized in what they do, and so just various ways of identifying what pigments were made of, what underdrawings, what the technology was, and so on. It was just really fascinating, and just in a way that I hadn't engaged with paintings itself, because as architects, I think that even though we work with historic buildings, there is a tendency to focus on the overall rather than the minute. And a lot of the buildings that I know that I hadn't really interacted with buildings which had paintings on them. So just taught me a lot about different mediums and just different types of conservation. So it was just really fascinating as a project, both in terms of trying to understand who was a part of the process itself, because suddenly you have this trust, then you have the and all of this was private, right, in a way that is unusual. So yeah, it was, I think, a big learning experience in terms of what I saw, but as well as how it operated.
I'm not sure how detailed if you know about this topic, but what goes into preserving such wall painting? Can you talk about the techniques and science involved in preserving the wall paintings?
Sure. I think so. I mean, I think that because I'm not a wall painting specialist, I think I can compare it to buildings and then talk about it in that context. So, with any of these structures, right? First is to identify its existing condition and why it's gotten there. So it's the same with Fort High School. It's the same with the wall paintings as well. The principle is similar in that you have to evidence what is there actively happening and why it's there and what's created that problem, right? So for example, one of the big issues in historic buildings is that people don't clean drains and people don't maintain paths. So then, like, when drains are not cleaned and so on, those portions of the building kind of tend to absorb a lot of damp, and then you have vegetation growth. So similar to wall paintings, in that there's a lot of if there are cracks, if there are issues that are existing, then there's water, and then they make water entering the building, and then they rise to a multiple set of problems, right? So I think the first any process of conservation begins with documenting what is there at present and kind of identifying what the issues are, right? So for example, you see discoloration somewhere, or you see growth of some kind of algae or whatever, you kind of identify these things, photograph them, and then you test for whether what it is, right? So For example, on these wall paintings, often they would find salts because salts are created because their perhaps is damp and so on. So then you have crystallizing of salts. So then, since they've photographed the salts, then they would take a sample of the salt and identify what it is, right? And most of these processes are not about restore, I mean, they're more about kind of preventing further loss as opposed to kind of trying to bring back what was, right? Because colors have faded over time, things have changed. So like, for example, stone, any stone, right, acquires this layer of patina, so kind of discoloration over it. So the point is not to restore the original color, but then to prevent further eroding of the stone, right? And it's the same with paintings, in that the point is not to restore the vibrancy of the original color, because that means that then you're painting anew, which is not what is historic. So the point is to prevent these salts from turning up or this damp from turning up. So kind of the process evolves from there, which is not trying to reverse what has happened, to rather prevent further deterioration.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mhm.
I wasn't really aware of to what degree, like you mentioned, is it recolored or
Yeah.
uh, is it preserved? Uh, but are also some paintings cut out of the building walls and then preserved, or preserved in clean rooms or something like that?
Oh, I think there were like there were. I mean, this is what I understand, and this I'm saying anecdotally because I haven't read enough about it. But there was this Italian preservation method which involved cutting parts of the building out, or of wall painting out, and then taking them elsewhere, which is then displayed in museums in Europe and so on. But it's a very dated and looked down upon kind of method now, for various different reasons. So mostly the treatment that is kind of approved of is treating on site. But I mean, when you were talking about kind of this trying to not restore the vibrancy and so on, this is also another battle which is the same of the why are historic buildings not being saved, right? In that people's expectation of what is beautiful or what is to be preserved is these kind of grand, bright, and these kind of things. So even though a lot of effort goes into kind of this restoration process, because people want, or and when I say people, I'm just talking about lay public kind of expectations from historic structures and aesthetic standards and so on. um, New is always kind of considered good, right? And so I think people sometimes can be disappointed with the fact that the red is not very looking very red and is looking more orange, or the expectation from these things is for it to look anew after the process, as opposed to for it to not decay further. And so there's this constant battle between how do the restorers kind of cater to that, but at the same time not tamper with what the historic material, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, uh, that's interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can understand. Usually,
Yeah.
when I visit, I tend to want to have the things look as they were back then. But yeah, that's totally wrong, I would say now.
Mm.
uh, as a structural engineer, I'm curious on preserving the structural integrity of the
Mm.
building.
Mhm.
Do you have you experience, or do you know about preserving or restoring the structural integrity?
So usually we do call a structural engineer to consult on projects, but then obviously, as you can tell, when you're reverse engineering something and trying to understand how they built it, it's quite difficult to do tests and kind of determine and ascertain, whether some parts of it, because you're kind of probing something that's already built, right? And in ways that you can't perhaps measure. So, for example, in Fort High School, there was a structural engineer that helped us consult. So, like, we made huge pits at the building to look at the foundation and see whether there's any tilts and so on. But then these are not really scientific methods I mean, in the sense that they're more observational methods or qualitative methods as opposed to quantitative. So again, like, and a lot of it has to do with observation experience, and as opposed to kind of being able to measure and know. And so even roofing and things like that, most of it has to do with visual observations and qualitative, what worked in one place, and then trying to derive from that, as opposed to knowing that this material or this span needs this, for example, in a way that you can do a new building with. So I think that it's always a bit of a cyclic process that you try, and then you might end up with error, and then you kind of go back. But yeah, structural consultants are extremely important, according to me, within that process, right?
Yeah. Are the kinds of reinforcement structures quite different? Because I see some of the pictures, I see a lot of wood and steel in
Yeah.
different combinations. So, do you know about? Can you talk about those differences that we see from today's materials?
Oh yeah, yeah. So basically, like, I mean, I put it in a simplistic way, but the way we construct now, modern constructions are like kind of like we build a skeleton, and everything that fills it is really not structural, right? So like your columns and beams in modern buildings are what acts as the support of the building, whereas the walls itself are just kind of curtains, really, so they can be anywhere. So I mean, because of the foundation that supports these beams and columns is what really props up buildings. But historically, without these systems, of course, I mean, I'm not my area of expertise is more colonial era buildings, which is 19th century to 20th century buildings. So this is kind of before reinforcement has happened, right? Or maybe at some points at the late 19th to the early 20th, it's begun to be introduced, but it's not being used in the same expansive way that we use now. So the walls are very thick because they bear the load, which is there, they support the building as opposed to now, right? So the walls
Hmm.
are thick, they can even measure 50 centimeters, so half a meter really, or and onwards. So, and apart from which, the roofing itself is also usually different types of techniques. So because we don't have these long spans which we can get now because of beams, we couldn't get then, right? So techniques that we used were roofing systems like what we call Madras terrace roofing system, which is basically so wooden beams or rafters, which are smaller than what we think of beams now, are put together, kind of laid out, over which you lay out tiles, which are almost like clay tiles, which are flat, and you lay them out, and then you lay another layer of clay tiles intersecting that, and then you kind of pour lime concrete, or I mean lime, a mixture of lime basically, which is again doesn't it acts as a binding material and is a mortar, but is not obviously cement based, right? Because it's lime based. So and then kind of that kind of how do you say binds this roofing structure. So and that's how you get spans, or a 5 meter span has a roof and so on. But again, like flat roofs were different then, right? We didn't actually have as many, and because they were complicated and they were expensive to build, whereas almost everything that we build now is flat roofed usually, because it's easy to do that. So I mean, there's so much. What's interesting is also not to just see kind of what they built like in the past, but then in some of these buildings you can really see the transition into like more like for the into newer ways of building. So you'll see multiple types of structures. So sometimes sloping roof, sometimes this Madras terrace type of roof, sometimes even reinforcement even in the historic buildings.
Let's move on to the bubonic plague. Before
Mhm.
we dive into the epidemic of
Mhm.
1896, which later hit Bangalore in 1898.
Yeah.
If I'm not wrong, can you describe what Bangalore was like back then? Can you talk about the population, the kind of trade, transportation system, healthcare, and the overall layout of the city right before the plague?
Mm, okay. So before the plague, in yeah, so I mean, let me say something about the plague first. So the bubonic plague came through maritime routes, right? So was carried by ship from other countries to India, and then which found itself in Bombay, and supposedly kind of transported across parts of the country through the railway system, through the railway station that the British had built. So by then, kind of, there had been many cholera epidemics and so on. And the difference between pandemic and epidemic is the scale, and everyone is now familiar with what the difference between pandemics and epidemics are, thanks to COVID-19. So there had been multiple sort of small epidemics throughout India of cholera, which were supposed to be endemic to the regions, but really nothing much had been done, or large scale, to address these issues, right? And also by then, kind of perceptions of disease were that there was something about it's called miasma theory, which is basically disease was thought to predominate from kind of these airs that waft from places. So it's like inherent to the environment, as opposed to how we understand it now, where there is a mechanism of transmission, right, from one person to another, which is germ
Mm.
theory. So I mean, there were these very dated understandings of where disease came from and predicated from as well. And then at the same time, not much was being done in terms of public health, right? But then now, once the plague strikes, it really scares and sends these shockwaves throughout Europe, because they've experienced the Black Death, and it kind of scared the hell out of them. So then various European countries said they would put a trade embargo on the British um, and their empire, because of the fact that they didn't want it to come and spread to different parts. So suddenly this changes the why the response is so severe, in that they because they're threatened with a trade embargo is when they start to address the plague, right? So it's a very protectionist, as opposed to, oh, this is for the people sort of thing. So it's very much to kind of not be blamed, or not be penalized for inaction, basically, that puts the colonial government into working. But then what happens is, by this time, Bangalore's kind of developing as this bifurcated city. So then you have these two parts, right? Which is the civil and military station, which is what was, for in simple ways, the European part of the city, even though it wasn't fully European. But this construction was created, and Cubbon Park separates it from what is the native part of the city, right? Which is supposed to be Bangalore city. So these two halves of the city existed by this time, and what happens with the plague is that kind of it gives them reason, it gives the government reason to enact these very draconian laws, as well as these huge changes within governance itself, because they're like, okay, we have to respond to this emergency, right? But then they themselves, lacking the knowledge of what this disease was and how it spread, meant that they kind of enact these laws in various different avenues. So one of the big ones was planning. So convinced that kind of these some of these localities were the reason for the disease, and some people in particular, and you can imagine that they are marginalized groups, are the cause for the disease, is what they believed, when we know in reality that that's not the case, because we understand what the bubonic plague was now. So many, like, they had many of these slum redevelopments, so they would just kind of raise to the ground these huts, and various quite impoverished people would get displaced and dispossessed, or basically taken to camps, and things like that. And new localities came in, right? And so really, and while this process, most people look at it very simplistically, right? Like, oh, new development, this is good housing because it was planned. And but the reality was that suddenly land which was not very valuable was being sold for huge value. So it was really a profit making enterprise as well. So it really starts to change the landscape of the city, because the plague hits, but then the impacts of the plague kind of go on for 20-25 years after that. So the city starts to begin to expand, because all these new localities come up in the name of hygienic housing. But the reality is also they're obviously very profitable development projects that's making huge revenue for the government and the municipalities.
So that was primarily for social distancing and trying to isolate the plague, and hence moving to new localities or new housing. So that was the main reason, or was it understood, or was it just used as a reason, like you said?
Used as a reason, but I don't think it was as much social distancing, as opposed to some populations and some localities believing to have inherently had the disease.
Okay.
So quite racist ways of some populations being more prone to the disease, and, like, problematic records saying, oh, but European officers are not getting this disease. And well, that's really not true, right? Because we know that. And so kind of these ideas. And then people moving away because they don't really know the cause of the disease. They don't really know. So only later, and by the turn of the 20th century, they start to realize that it's rats, but it's not just rats, it's fleas on rats that are carrying this disease, right? So they don't know really what the cause is. So they kind of inherently believe that it's just the way Indians are living, or it's the way some Indians are living that's creating this disease. So constantly these discussions in the records can keep showing, oh, they're huddled up in these dark houses and that's what causes the disease, when we know that that's not what causes the disease. So it's less about social distancing as opposed to having very fixed ideas of what will be hygienic, and trying to import what they thought of hygiene from parts in Europe to India, or at least attempting to.
Uh, how did the plague transform Bangalore with respect to architecture? You talked about the layout,
Mhm.
but the roads and infrastructure, and where can you see some of those transformation in today's Bangalore?
So some one of my arguments is that okay. So many parts of the city are impacted by the plague. So many of these localities were influenced by it. So Fraser Town, towns that came, then even Malleshwaram, Basangudi, Chamrajpet. So some of these existed. So Chamrajpet had already existed or had come into existence before the plague hits. And then Chamrajpet had this kind of form of housing where the houses abutted each other. But then, having experienced the plague, they were convinced that it's because of the walls shared by different housing that's how the disease is spreading. So uh, they changed, or the logic was to change that a house should be located within a compound that's surrounded by a setback, because it is the ground that carried it, so they didn't want the walls to be sharing. So then that kind of influenced the way housing was built. So then you have a house surrounded by a compound built in multiple localities. So like Fraser Town, for example, or even Cooktown has these kind of houses which have a compound around, so ground around it. So that's a big influence, I would say, about the plague in Bangalore. um Also so much of yeah, just the I think the rapidness with these localities came about is also owed in part to the plague, right? Because there was suddenly another urgency created by the plague to kind of get these localities quite quickly made, so that people who they were living in congested parts could kind of move to them. But of course, it's not everyone that was allowed to move to them, because you have to afford it to move to it. So I think that it changed. I think it's very visible, and it's in any of these planned localities. I think that division is very visible still today.
You describe how this epidemic was an important time in history
Mhm.
of India, during which the Western medicine was being slowly accepted
Yeah.
by a larger group of Indians. But did this also act as a catalyst, which eventually led to the active study in medicine and setup of clinics and medical institutions that we see today?
Yeah. I mean, so it's both, right? We have to take this as for what it is, which is that I'm using the analogy of trains here. So a lot of people will come back from colonialism and say, "Oh, but colonialism gave us trains," you know. And then, yeah, I mean, they built trains to export materials and take them to different parts of the country so that they could send it and ship it abroad. So, I mean, so healthcare coming about because of it, I don't think is necessarily some kind of or any of these actions towards treatment is not, I think, should be read for what it is, which is that it was another part of the colonizing civilizing mission, right, in which they thought that they have to change the ways in which this country functions, as opposed to any sort of generosity or magnanimity that was any of these things were designed with. So okay. So, in terms of even the people who find the vaccines, right? Some of these are medical practitioners from Europe who are kind of coming to India to try to make their careers out of it and test on different people, and then win Nobel Prizes and be known for this. So, these people are not just doing it from the goodness of their heart or something, right? They're also coming for various different reasons to come and do these things. So, but mainly when I say that people begin to accept Western medicine, it's not because of the fact that suddenly people have been educated into it and they now understand how Western medicine is the light to follow or something. It kind of is forced on people, right, in this very sudden way. So you've had this ignoring of public health throughout the 19th century, throughout the long 19th century, and suddenly, only when these trade embargoes come about, suddenly you realize, okay, if we don't do something about it, we're going to be penalized. So then these responses are kind of triggered by that, right? So they kind of force and impose vaccinations on people and so on. And again, these are all trial and error methods. So there's so many records saying how people were really scared of it because they don't understand what it is, because suddenly it's an engagement with something so different from people might have had. But also the painting of inhabitants in the city and Indians to be very, how do you say, not being accepting of Western medicine in a way that that they're painted as kind of some savages who don't understand it. So I think there is a duality in what they were trying to do, right? And suddenly overnight, when you introduce an entire new way of treating medicine, I think it takes a lot of time to adapt for people as well. And so when they actually, so a big part of it, and I don't know enough, and so I'm just going to say superficially, a big part of what happens with Tilak becoming popular in terms of the national movements is because of the plague, for example, because people in Pune are, they're going on house searches and trying to identify the disease and doing quite invasive things. And so really it becomes to infuriate a lot of Indians, and they start to react quite aggressively against this sort of colonial imposition.
Uh, so you've worked on this plague. How long have you worked on this plague for? Before I ask the question, can you tell me how long have you been researching this subject?
So my research is not just on the plague, but basically it kind of looks at housing and these residential suburbs that kind of get built between a period between 1881 to about 1920 in Bangalore. And but what one of the big things that I'm saying is that the plague influences so much of how it's built and shaped, right? So it's really my PhD project that I kind of began applying for in about 2018, and then I was awarded a scholarship and then began researching it in 2019. So I've been doing this research for about 2 years and a couple of months actively, but then I suppose the interest began before that.
Uh, so, do you think we've missed some lessons from the bubonic plague that we could have incorporated into our current situation? Do you see uh, something interesting that could have eased out what with the current trends of COVID?
Mm, I mean, there's so many things that we should relate to, right? Just in terms of marginalization itself, like, the blaming of disease on poorer and marginalized populations is not something that's unique. And what's interesting is that it just happened even now. So, like, suddenly, without taking names, there are like huge Muslim groups that were meeting were blamed to be spreading the disease and so on. And these kind of ideas are not new. They really have been not changed. And it's kind of quite shameful that that's the case, right? But also, even in terms of migrants moving back from these big cities, the same thing happened during the bubonic plague, which is that the migrants who are very precarious in terms of very working class migrants working on construction sites, working in terms of sanitation of the city, whether it's cleaning, whether it's sweeping, whether it's the paurnamikas and so on. It's the same then, in that mainly the sanitation and drainage and sewage systems really relied on such human labor, right? And not much has changed in that way. So without these people who were working and helping with this, I mean, so many records talk about how the cities were kind of like mountains of filth, because many of these populations were not protected in any way or given any incentives or helped in any way to deal with the plague as well. And I mean, I could just see the same things now. So the biggest fear of the colonial government and why they were kind of monitoring trains and, I mean, there were no buses, but trains and other public transport kind of systems, was because they were so scared that it had come to these urban centers, right, and was going to be taken and go back to rural India as well. And they kept being fearful that if they limited it within the urban centers, then that it wouldn't spread everywhere. But then, in trying to do that, it's not only surveillance that you have to do. How do people who don't have very much sustain for months on end without jobs, without incentives, without I don't know, support? So I don't know. I think it's very humbling when we think back about historically how little has changed. And I suppose I think it's also ironic that the law that gets introduced in 1897, which is called the Epidemics Act, Epidemics and Diseases Act, is really what got even put during the COVID pandemic now. So it's that same colonial era law. And so I think that much has to be said and discussed about how much is owed to colonialism in these draconian ways of acting as a government.
Uh, you talked a bit about transportation, and you specifically mentioned buses, which I highly advocate. Uh,
Mhm.
can can you talk about public transportation, or in general the transportation the design of pedestrian pathways and roadways, if you've come across in your research?
Historically, you mean?
Yes, during the plague or during, yeah, historically.
So, I mean, I don't know. Apart from basically, Bangalore was quite interconnected, and it's actually on the Maratha MSM. What is that? It's the Maratha Southern Railway, which is basically where the first case of the plague gets recorded itself, right? Because one of the symptoms of the plague was that they would develop these swellings on their bodies called buboes, and so that's where they discover the first case. So I think that they had quite a interconnected train service, and so the trains were monitored constantly because they didn't want people to leave or people to come in carrying the disease. But apart from that, I don't know enough to say about how how pedestrian traffic worked.
Uh, uh, this also you talked quite a bit about how research or historical research can help us. Uh, can you talk about uh, research that specifically looks into architecture and the cultural response to, say, the epidemic? Uh, what can we learn from those, and how can that help us build better cities and communities in the future?
Um, I think that I suppose I don't know if I've made it clearly enough, but I suppose what I've been trying to allude to is that people think of architecture and design as somehow apolitical or removed from the realities of everyday life, right? And they're very much entwined and are representative of what everyday life is and politics is. Um, so I just think that if design and architecture don't address everyday issues of people and public spaces and the lack of it, then there's very little to kind of push forward with. Whereas, um, how do I say? So I think that it became very obvious how we lacked public spaces within the city. So when we're during lockdown, there were so limited ways that I could walk where apart from walking in residential localities, like there was nowhere to go. And so I think that these are glaring observations that public spaces are actually now being used as commercial spaces like malls. And these are not public spaces, are they? So if as designers, as architects, as urban planners, if we don't think about these scenarios and think about how all of these things are interconnected, I think that we don't really take lessons from the past and we don't really cater to wider discussions. And I think they're all enmeshed. So I don't think you can design or be an architect without paying heed to kind of these social movements or political movements.
Uh, Do you see yourself working on design and planning of futures, towns, and cities? I know you're occupied with academia right now, but maybe in the future, do you plan on actively working on building?
I don't see myself working on planning because I don't think I'm either trained or also, yeah, it's just not what I'm interested in or I feel I can contribute to. But I do see that I can work still with historic buildings and trying to sort of complicate our relationship with historic buildings, and which is a part of planning in itself, right?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I have some questions that I ask my guests on
Mhm.
every episode. So, what are you currently working on in your research, in your career, and also in your life?
So I'm 2 years and 2 months into my PhD, and that might go on for about another year and a half. So I'm just sort of writing a few chapters for that. Um, I think that so and you, sorry, your second question is what else I'm working on and what I want to work for in the future.
Uh, yeah, just what are your plans currently, and where do you see yourself in a few years, or what do you see yourself working on?
So, for me, especially, I think that this might apply to many historians and many people who write about India. The the relationship between practice and academia is not so obvious, right? It's more blurred because when you have very little records or you want to challenge the historic records that exist, which are very colonial, a lot of what you do is actually go and physically measure buildings and look at things yourself and examine sites, not just sit in a sort of look at only archives. So, in terms of practice, these kind of go hand in hand with what you're writing. So, I see myself doing that or continuing to do that. I think I'd like to continue to do that. Whether they'll have me is a different thing altogether. Um, yeah, and I think that I suppose I see myself as someone who's contributing to discourse and trying to make the history of these cities, or Bangalore in particular, quite compelling for people to see and understand and feel like they're a part of something bigger as opposed to these isolated monuments, right? And I think that I hope to do that through my academic work.
Can you name some books that you value?
Um, I suppose, what do you call it? I mean, so there's obviously what I read for the PhD, but then I think that something that I really enjoy, which enmeshes a lot of what I do with the PhD, which is post-colonial theory and history, is anything written by Amitav Ghosh, right? So I would recommend literally anything written by him, whether it's Glass Palace or the Ibis trilogy. I think that something that really stood out to me, if you're interested in trying to understand the plague in colonial medicine, though he's not talking about the plague per se, and it's more malaria, I would recommend Calcutta Chromosome by him. I mean, it just paints a fantastical image of this sort of medical practitioner coming from Europe called Ronald Ross, and how he engages with the Indians in trying to find the cure for malaria. And he weaves this amazing narrative. So I think that uh, I mean, that book just gave me a lot of food for thought. So I would just recommend reading anything of his to kind of gauge a better picture of maybe perhaps the lens that I'm trying to contribute to.
What values in life are important to you?
In general,
Yeah, in general, this podcast is themed around creating value. So, do you have any suggestions, or what do you find? What values you find are important?
empathy and kindness more than anything else, I suppose. Empathy towards everyone and just building more emphatic structures that support people in all forms, and solidarity with marginalized groups, I suppose. So the empathy to be able to do that, the kindness to be able to do that, and not in ways of charity or doing good or savior ways, but just have that inherently to understand and recognize inequalities. So empathy.
Where can people find out more about you and your work? How can they connect to you online?
I suppose at present, I mean, I do keep writing pieces here and there, and at the moment, and there are some academic things in the work, but I suppose now they could connect to me on my social media, which is Twitter, where might be the repository of where I post some new work or where I'd be speaking at, for example.
Uh, yes, this was really interesting and valuable. My historical background is really bad, but I learned so much today. So thank you so much for spending time with me and telling me about Bangalore and its history. And thank you for working in conservation projects. That's pretty cool. And also, I'm looking forward to reading your publications. So,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank you for taking time to speak with me.
Thank you for having me.